Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Pedro Regalado. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Stanford, and alongside my colleague, Catherine Oliverius, I help to guide the Western History Lecture Series. This is our third iteration of the year, and we are really excited to have James Michael Buckley, historian and urban planner, who traveled a long way to be here on 280 from San Francisco. Jim holds a master's degree in urban planning and a PhD in architecture from UC Berkeley, and he has taught planning and historic preservation at UC Berkeley, at MIT, at the University of Oregon. He is the author of City of Wood, San Francisco and the Architecture of the Redwood Lumber Industry. It was published in 2024 by University of Texas Press, and it has won many prizes. We were joking a minute ago that last year I chaired a panel that Jim was on, and I noted that he had won 2 awards, and since then we've added to that with about 3 more, maybe 4. Those include the 2026 Hagley Prize in Business History from the Business History Association, and also the 2025 John Brinkoff Jackson Prize from the Association of American Geographers. So here you get the sense that he's speaking to multiple crowds, and he's really making a splash with this really wonderful contribution. City of Wood makes a very bold argument, which is that the San Francisco and the redwood forests of Northern California were not separate worlds, one a bustling core on the one side and a remote resource periphery on the other, but a single, integrated regional space bound together by what Jim calls economic cords. To build that case, he moves fluidly between the micro and the macro, the shacks alongside the waterfront to the mansions on the hills, from Humboldt County logging camps to the downtown office hours of an emerging corporate core. And he asks us to take seriously the vernacular architecture of capitalism. So not the celebrated architects, but the everyday structures, the logging, the lumber yards, the mills, the company towns, the office buildings that really shaped how industrial capitalism was produced and how it was lived. It's a rich and tightly argued book, which is something I really appreciate. When you have very little time, Jim tells you exactly what he means. And one that has so much to contribute to the historiography of American capitalism and also of the American West. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Jim, and please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Pedro, and thanks to the Bill Lane Center and to Stanford in general. You've been strong supporters of Western history for a long time, including absorbing the library of the California Historical Society, a very valuable resource. So we're very appreciative that it's here and in good hands. So, in popular culture, the story of European Americans in California always seems to start with the gold rush, as it probably should, because everyone wants to know about the prospectors staking claims, the roaring camps, the jumping frogs, and so forth. But there are many stories about the people who gave up on the gold fields and found other interesting things to do based on the West's abundant natural resources. Take, for example, logging. Many frustrated gold miners had been loggers back east, and they soon realized there might be more gold for them in the region's vast forests than in panning for nuggets in Sierra streams. And they were rewarded because the population growth set off by the gold rush led to such a huge demand for lumber that forest products were one of the 5 largest manufacturing sectors in the Pacific states in almost every decade between 1860 to 1909, when it was the largest manufacturing sector. But lumber is not something we generally focus on when we tell the story of the American West. Maybe because the process doesn't change that much over time, or maybe it's such a common material we have around, we don't think about it as much. And when we do think about the lumber industry, we're more often interested in the stories of burly lumberjacks like these guys in remote camps, in far-off locations, far away from polite society. But the story is more complicated than that. I first got interested in the history of the redwood lumber industry when I went up to Scotia in Humboldt County several years ago, fascinated by what was going on there in this very old company town. And what struck me as I started looking at the history was that the architecture of one part of the redwood lumber industry was persistently tied to that of another part of the industry. The homes that were constructed of redwood in San Francisco depended on the built environment that was assembled in the forest to cut down those trees, and the communities that grew up around the operations in the woods were tied to the financial capital and demand in the urban core. And so, as I began to research redwood production in Humboldt County in San Francisco, I started to think of them not as two distant poles of the lumber industry, but as matching parts of what I realized was the extended regional city, one big urban complex. And this led to the idea of a city of wood as a device to illustrate how the built environment is connected across great distances. So, in this book, I ask you to imagine that the city, quote unquote, stretches from the urban center all the way to the forest. And this larger conurbation links together all the activities related to the industry across those locations, because decisions people made in the city affected the environment in the forest and vice versa. Now, some of you might be saying, this sounds a little familiar, and you'd be right, because a lot of this is based on the famous book by William Cronin, Nature's Metropolis, in which he talks about Chicago as being built by all the resources for the natural areas around it: lumber, wheat, livestock. And so he talks about this as what drives growth in Chicago. And he's an environmental historian, so he's mainly interested in how the city people go out and ruin the countryside. I'm interested in that too, but I'm also interested in how what happens in the countryside affects what happens in the big city as well. Uh, the landscape architect Jane Hutton calls these reciprocal landscapes because there's an exchange of material between them that affects what's going on in both of them. And I found this idea of a broader city of wood useful because I'm an architectural historian who's interested in the everyday environment. I love Frank Lloyd Wright. I love Mies van der Rohe, but I'm also really interested in everyday buildings. I'm interested in buildings that may not be designed by architects, but they're still really interesting. We call this vernacular architecture, or the architecture of the everyday, and cultural landscape studies, in which we look at the entire built environment, from buildings to streets to parks and everything around us. There's a nice intersection here with geography as well, because I'm looking at the spaces of history, and there's a good intersection with geography through the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre, who talks about spaces of history, the social construction of history, where actions take place, and what forces help shape them over time, and what we can learn from the historic evidence of space in addition to written records. In my book, my evidence includes existing buildings, of course, but also historic photographs and plans, and descriptions of locations and how people use them, like novels. Found a great dime novel from 1910 from someone who had worked in a lumber mill in Humboldt County, gave me a great description of what was going on in there and the kind of politics of what was going on in the industry as well. Company records, government testimonies, especially labor commissions, even a Walt Whitman poem, The Song of the Red One. If you're doing research and you find a Walt Whitman poem, it's very good because you know you're going to get an encyclopedic list of all the things going on in there. So that was great. So I use these to try to understand how people lived and worked and how social and economic changes affected them and their environment. And I'm particularly interested in working class history because workers don't often write too much about their experience. So maybe architecture and space can help us understand them and how they may have had some kind of agency. So this afternoon, I'd like to give you a quick tour of the city of Wood, from the forest to the city and then back again. And we'll see what goes on in these places. Of course, we know the coast redwoods are found only in a narrow band along the northern coast of California. They are, of course, among the tallest and oldest of living things. But redwood was so popular that it's led to the destruction of 95% of the original forest by the late 20th century. This map compares the original redwood forest area with the 5% of the original old growth that remains standing today, marked in red. And I focus my research on Humboldt County and the town of Eureka and the landscape of lumber in San Francisco. Redwood was in such demand because it grows for as long as 2,000 years and as a result can reach over 300 feet in height and be more than 20 feet wide. Redwoods produce a special kind of lumber. It's a very long trunk with branches that don't occur until the very top, so there are lots and lots of boards that don't have knot holes. It's a soft wood that is easily shaped into things like building trim, but it also has tannins that resist insects and can somewhat retard fire, so that was an important point. And most of the houses in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley before 1930 are built out of redwood. To understand this industry, I looked at what are called production value chains, which isn't that complicated. It's basically a supply chain that looks at the production points. So every step along the way where the value is added is an important point of how the industry is organized. And we start from felling a tree, cutting it up into pieces, transporting it to the mill, milling it into finished products. And the lumber companies were constantly moving around the pieces that were part of the value chain in the woods and the city in order to incorporate new technologies or to minimize labor costs or to try to control labor itself. And each of these shifts in the production chain changed the landscape of lumber either in the woods or in the city. Of course, the original production chain took place before Europeans arrived. Native people, including the Hupa, Wiyut, and Tolowa people, used fallen trees to build their plank homes and sweat houses, and to make canoes. And they were very low impact on the forest because they were using trees that had already fallen. As elsewhere in the West, American settlers violently removed indigenous people, sometimes through violent massacres, sometimes through resettling the survivors in federal reservations like the Hooper Reservation in Humboldt County. As Europeans moved in, many of them set up small partnerships in the woods to log the redwood forest. And they would put one partner in the woods to oversee logging and a sawmill that manufactured simple dimension lumber, and another partner in San Francisco to oversee marketing. Because in the first years of the industry, San Francisco served as the nerve center for the entire lumber industry of the West Coast, including pine from the Sierras, Doug fir and cedar from the Northwest, all came through San Francisco where it was shipped off to where else it was going to be going. The mills in the forest sent almost all their product to San Francisco throughout the 19th century, and they sent it by boat because, of course, there was no train directly to Humboldt County until 1914. And you might be familiar with the forest along Mendocino County where they had those dog hole ports and they had to send lumber on chutes out to the boats to bring it to San Francisco. They depended on the partner in San Francisco to sell whatever it was they sent. And technology was very important, as it was in every industry. We started to see production speed up with the mechanical improvements like, on the left, a steam donkey, which is basically a big steam engine that could pull logs through the forest on very thick wires, railroads, circular saws. And on the right is Evans' third saw. It's a weird contraption that tried to deal with the fact that the logs were generally too big to even work within the sawmills that they built. So they had to figure out new contraptions and ways to make it work. Redwood lumber production in the early years consisted of rickety old sawmills in the backwoods, like the Jolly Giant Mill pictured here. And they were surrounded by isolated mill villages occupied by lumberjacks who felled the giant trees and mill workers who sawed them into unfinished boards. These mill villages were typically laid out in a haphazard fashion around a cookhouse and a bunkhouse and a set of cabins and a bunch of work sheds. Historic photographs and insurance map can help us give a sense of what the space that was occupied by the workers in these towns. We can check out how much space they were allocated, the different sizes of houses, how much privacy one might expect, the proximity to the workplace, big sawmill, and here we can see that the village of Riverside had both a saloon and a general store. Saloons were not a given in these towns. Some owners preferred not to have them, as you might imagine. These pictures give us a sense of the paternalism that owners might have had with these workers, that they could take care of their most favorite workers with the nicest spaces, they could control behavior of workers, and they could certainly prevent any kind of union organizing activity in these remote locations. Companies also constructed several mills in the port town of Eureka in Humboldt County because Humboldt Bay there served as a transshipment point between the forest and the ships that were sent to San Francisco with the lumber. Many of you may know the William Carson Mansion that's still there. It looms over the whole town. It has this incredibly fancy wedding cake architecture. It was so ornate that modernist architects used to use it as an example of what not to do in architecture when you're designing it. So it's very fancy and very ornate. You usually see pictures of the Carson house like this. What you don't see is that the Carson House was actually located in the middle of all the production. You can see in the circle, that's the Carson House, and the mill is next to it on the left, and everything around it is filled up with stacks and stacks of lumber, drying and waiting to go down to San Francisco to be turned into whatever it was going to be turned into. Uh, William Carson owned this bay mill, and his partner was John Dolbear, who's the man who invented the steam donkey. So they had a lot of money, and he could build a very, very fancy house. Um, Workers for the Carson Company could find homes there behind the house in that neighborhood there, and I was able to track down some of the workers who lived in this area. They could find small houses close to their employment, and the census records show that some of the workers in these houses that are labeled A, B, C, D, and E included an Irish machine operator with a wife and a newborn daughter, a teamster with a family of 5, and a saw filer who was from Maine and had a small family in that house near the Carson mansion. If we pull out to look at the city overall in Eureka, we can get a better idea of the kinds of experiences workers had there. You can see on the right, there is the Carson Mansion and the Bay Mill next to it, and the area in the neighborhood behind where the workers lived. If you go a little bit to the left, Area 4, that's the downtown, the central business district. And if you go further to the left, you see Area 1, that's the hotel district. That's where the alternative for workers. Some workers prefer to be near the mill, under the protection or the paternalistic aspect of their employer. Others moved to the other end of town and lived in single-room occupancy hotels and rooming houses in this part of town. And this I kind of call the fun zone, because you can see the Western Hotel here. And if you lived at the Western Hotel or worked there, you had a variety of entertainments you could go to. Right around the Western Hotel, you've got the saloon, billiards, barber and baths. You've got gentlemen's furnishings, a saloon, more barbers and baths. Across the street, you've got saloon and billiards. You've got a shooting gallery, cigar saloon, saloon boarding, saloon, billiards, opera hall. So this, many people felt, was the place to live in Eureka, and they had a very wild time while living there. I also was able to locate an area called the brothel district, where houses were identified as female boarding houses. And these were the number of them that were located just to the south of the hotel district. And there were other ones that are marked D for dwelling that may have been brothels as well. We just don't know. And you can see that it's also mixed up with hotels and planing mills at work areas. So it was a mixed use district very close to where some of the workers lived. And we also locate the Chinatown. Chinatown housed workers who did very menial jobs, as typically was the case. Chinese people were not welcome in the mills. One mill tried to hire Chinese workers. There was a strike, and the Chinese workers were fired the next day. They worked in laundries, of course. They worked at household jobs, and they helped build the railroads around, but they did not work in the lumber industry itself. And you might be able to make out it says vacant in one part of that. This is from 1889. In 1886, the people of Eureka chased the Chinese people out of Eureka entirely and were not welcome to come back. So as a case, the typical discrimination against Asian workers in California at that time. Okay, let's go to the other end of the city of Wood in San Francisco. Throughout the 19th century, as I said, the bulk of the lumber from the redwood forest continued to be sent to San Francisco to be used for construction in the city and also for products like pipes, tanks, and even railroad ties. It was a very multiple use kind of material. And it was also then sent to other places in the West and abroad for orders from those places. But San Franciscans were very aware of the connection between the North Woods and the city itself, as expressed in this ad from the Redwood Manufacturers Company in 1920. It compares a forest monarch and a city giant, which is the Hobart building on Market Street in San Francisco, which was where the office of the Redwood Manufacturers Company was located in 1920. So they were making this connection in a broad way between the forest and the city. They were connected in this idea of a city of wood directly. And the wood that came to San Francisco went to two places on the waterfront. The earlier area was the Stewart Street Lumber District, closer to Market Street, and all along those wharves would be stacks of lumber that were coming from all over the West, and also the Mission Creek Lumber District along Mission Creek. The ballpark today is located right around the K in Creek, so that was the area that was one of the most important areas where the lumber was being unloaded. And if you look at the insurance maps from that time, you can see how much lumber there was. Looks kind of like the area around the Carson house, that these were stacks and stacks lined up in rows like streets of stacks of lumber all throughout the Mission Creek Channel area. And you can also see that there are planing mills, the factories that made building trim and other products, scattered around throughout this area. It's interesting that the production at this point in time, the late 19th century, was very distributed. There were many small firms that did this kind of work. There weren't very big organizations that did this kind of work, and it meant that workers could often work their way up into being owners themselves. It was kind of an easy way for workers to become owners as well. It also meant that no one owner could become dominant in the market. There were so many different groups that we don't have any companies that grew into the kind of company that we've heard of today. We don't really recognize any of the names of people that ran these planing mills. There was one family that kind of dominated, however, which was the Hooper family. The Hooper family came from Maine in the 1850s. They had a sawmill in Humboldt County in Trinidad and planing mills in San Francisco. And here's the first home of the patriarch, John A. Hooper, which was a small house in Rincon Hill, probably under the Bay Bridge today. He and his brothers were involved in both lumber and mining, and they tried to corner the market redwood lumber in 1883 through an organization called the California Redwood Company. They acquired a lot of forest land and mills, but it turns out they did this fraudulently, like a lot of people did in the West. Through the Timber and Stone Act, you could go up to the government and say, I'd like my 160 acres for farmland, but you can't really farm the redwood forest. It's too hard to get the trees down. So they hired people to get the land. The government found out about it. The whole thing fell apart. So no one ever really cornered the market in redwood. But they also pioneered their own brand of redwood lumber called Excelsior, and they initiated the idea of a chain of retail stores, which they had in Southern California, where they sent the wood. And through all that activity, John A. Hooper became very rich, and he was able to build this fancy house in Pacific Heights, where he lived for many years. He also owned property downtown, and his son, C.A. Hooper, developed the city of Pittsburgh, California. So there were a lot of tentacles reaching out from the kind of work these owners were doing with lumber in the Bay Area. One of the things that changed in the physical landscape of lumber in San Francisco was the more the industry grew, the more administrative work there was to do. And at first, companies did all their clerical work right there at the dock where the lumber came in, but there became too much of it. And so eventually, people began to take offices in the growing central business district. And it was interesting to find that they actually took offices very close to each other. So here's the bottom of California Street at Market, and we can see three different redwood lumber companies who are located close to each other. And it gives us a sense of how people were really trying to keep an eye on the market, trying to keep on what's going on. I won't exactly make a connection to Silicon Valley today, but I think it's the same idea of what's going on in the industry. I have to keep track of what's happening, and I want to be close to the competition at all times. I was also able to track many of the workers in the redwood lumber industry in San Francisco through maps and census records. And again, it gives us a sense of the kind of conditions that they might have lived in. Here on the left, south of Market District was an area of very small homes. And so workers would crowd into those areas in the alley dwellings, and many of which are still there today. Skilled workers were able to move out into what were suburbs at the time, like the Mission District. The middle picture is a set of houses in the Mission District where a skilled worker might be able to afford to go. But there was a third group of workers who were basically the floating army of labor. They were people who would work for a while in redwood forests, then they would go work on the farms, then they would go work on the railroads, and they would always float through San Francisco into the single room occupancy residential hotels in that area. So this was a very temporary group that would move in and out based on what they wanted to do and where the opportunities would be located. Another part of the city that was shaped in part by the lumber industry was the waterfront, where where lumber was very important. And as you might imagine, the waterfront in the 19th century was a very rough, worker-oriented place, and there was a lot of organizing and a lot of solidarity parades. There was a particular union of workers who worked on lumber ships. They weren't part of the sailors union. They had their own union because it was very difficult to keep track, to put the lumber on the ships and then keep them steady as they made their way out to San Francisco. So lumber stevedores had their own union, and they were also very effective in trying to organize other parties through their work. Um, they weren't very successful in trying to connect to the workers in Humboldt County. Humboldt County had a very poor record in trying to organize unions because workers were so scattered and the company's owners were so dominant, they couldn't really make this work. But in San Francisco, many of the business owners were concerned about the waterfront and how it seemed to be a place that fostered a lot of things going on they didn't like, and they expressed concern about it. So this is an example of how you might use architecture to keep things orderly. And in 1914, the city developed this plan you see today of these classical bulkheads that were designed. And a business person wrote an article in the Chronicle saying, "Beauty in the harbor front, why not beautify the Watergate to receive manifest destiny?" Of course, the Panama Canal was just about to open. So there is this idea that if we have an orderly architectural environment, we'll have an orderly social environment as well. I'm not trying to be a Marxist about this. I'm just trying to express that it's possible that people saw a way that they could use design to impact what was going on. Let's go back to Humboldt County for the final phase of the redwood industry development, and that is the corporate phase. Because in the early 20th century, there was a big change in which the redwood lumber industry was consolidated into three large corporations, and these replaced all those small partnerships that had been in place earlier. And they built huge vertically integrated sawmills like the Pacific Lumber Company's Mill A here, world's largest redwood mill. Um, they took finished production processes out of San Francisco. So all those little planing mills that had been in San Francisco, they cut out the middleman. They said, we're going to make these products here in the forest, and we're going to make that money that we are actually giving away to people making that elsewhere. And they had payrolls that numbered in the thousands of workers. So they had a huge operation going, and they decided to construct a company town. Each of them had a company town that would house their workers and that they would have some control over. Here's Scotia in about the 1960s, and Mill A that was just mentioned is on the far end of town. And this is Mill B, an even bigger mill that was built in the 1920s. And you can see in between the town of Scotia with lots of single family homes and a very cute little downtown that was designed to help people want to be there. I'll also point out across the river, across the Eel River, there's a little village up there. It's called Rio Del now, but I'll come back to that in a second because it played an important role. So around 1910, Pacific Lumber built a very cute little downtown with a lot of amenities for its workers. There's a social club. They were one of the people who did not want to have saloons, so you could go to the social club, but you couldn't drink. You could play cards, no booze. You see the office. You see they had a baseball team here on Sunday. They had a movie theater, and they had a store. And if you go to the right, on the very right-hand side, they had a bank for workers so that you could deposit your money there and be a good citizen and build for the future. The idea was that they were hoping to both meet workers' needs and keep them in place, but also to encourage married workers to work for them because they'd be less likely to quit. So these cute little houses that are still there in Scotia, the town's been sold off by Pacific Lumber now. People own their houses individually, but for decades, people rented from the company, and the company would take care of the maintenance and take care of their houses for them. And here's the movie theater that was a key part of that aspect. Company towns were response to several factors. The threat of strikes, because this is the era of the IWW, the Wobblies, who never really took hold in the Redwoods as they did in the Northwest, but there was concern about it. There were those floating workers who were coming and going, and they wanted to try and keep a handle on them. And there were also many migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who had different ways, and the company wanted to try to Americanize them. And this is actually a very common theme in industry at the time. Is called welfare work, and corporations were trying to get workers to be acclimated to the U.S. and to be good workers and learn how to live a good life. So here are more of the worker houses. And I mentioned Rio Dell. Rio Dell at the time across the river was called Wildwood because it had all the things you couldn't get in Scotia. So here you see the pool hall, of course, the typical saloons. All this was taking place across the river. So Wildwood was kind of the escape valve for workers who lived in Scotia. Rio Dell is still there as well. As these corporations grew, they began to be concerned because they were spending lots and lots of money on workers and on operations, and they began to be concerned that maybe they didn't have enough wood for the future. If they're going to spend this much money on production, they better make sure they were going to have timber in the future. It was just beginning to dawn on people. The redwoods wouldn't go on forever at the pace they were cutting. So in the 1920s, these corporations embraced the new profession of industrial forestry, and they also embraced things like planting trees for the future and sustained yield forestry, so that they would make sure they would have the material they needed well into the future. And the public was also becoming very concerned about this. They were beginning to see how many of these groves were gone. The ancient groves were being threatened. And so a women's club in Humboldt County was trying to preserve major groves on the highway. Here they are trying to promote a bond issue for the state to be able to buy that. And it really was women's organizations who led the environmental effort in the early years of the 20th century. They helped expand concern about the loss of redwood forests, and they were very politically active in saving them. And a lot of this work took place in San Francisco, the advocacy for the redwoods. We could think of the Sierra Club and the Save the Redwoods League in the early part of the century. Right around this time, then around 1900, we have the growth of the Sempervirens Fund, which promoted the development of Big Basin Redwood Park. And we have Muir Woods developed at this time in 1908. William Kent made a private acquisition of that Muir Woods Grove in Marin County and donated it to the federal government as a national monument. Now, my book ends in 1929 because the Depression, of course, changes everything. But time does march on, history marches on, and I'll give you a quick overview of the history since then. In the early 20th century, just as these corporations were rising, people began to have to pay more for redwood. Redwood was more expensive because the big trees were gone. People had to look harder to find that wood with the good heartwood in it. And so cheaper woods like Douglas fir and pine were beginning to replace redwood for structural use. But the industry, being an industry, said we need to find some new uses for redwood. And they worked with architects to develop the idea of redwood as sort of a material for the future, a modern material. And they worked with the 1930s with progressive architects to develop a sort of West Coast version of modernism by incorporating this material into sleek new homes throughout California. So, for example, here in San Francisco, is the Henry Cowell House by Morrow and Morrow in 1933. It has an exterior of unpainted shiplap siding of redwood. And Richard Neutra's first wood-sheathed house, the redwood-clad Darling House of 1937, which displayed redwood as an emblem of modern life. After the Depression, redwood became more and more popular during California's home building boom. This graph shows that production rose by more than double in the 1960s as that California housing boom went on. The industry consolidated further with the southern firm of Georgia Pacific buying some of those firms. And we entered into a new economic phase of what we might call Fordist capitalism after Henry Ford. The idea that you have a huge corporation, you have a pact with your workers to make sure that they're getting what they need, they won't go on strike. And so we had big business and big labor kind of working together with higher wages and more consistent productivity on the assembly line. Um, the the effort worked well for workers because they were able to get more opportunities, they were able to get more money, they were able to buy cars, which enabled them to move to houses that were away from the mill. So we have a dispersion of the production in the woods. This idea of redwood modernism filtered down to the general public in ideas like the ranch house or other mass market forms of housing that emphasized the connections between indoor and outdoor living. Here's an Eichler home. Eichler was one of the merchant builders that incorporated redwood into their designs. And redwood is, of course, also marketed as a material for backyard uses like fences, decks, and pergolas. And there was even an experiment to try and make it into plywood, which didn't work that well. While some firms continued to practice sustained yield harvesting, like Pacific Lumber, others began clear cutting, and this raised a lot of concern in the public about the long-term health of the forest. And this led to new environmental regulations on a federal and state level on limiting the harvesting, and also to the establishment of the vast Redwood National Park in Del Norte County in 1968. But of course, the most recent chapter is the chapter of what we might call finance capitalism, which upended the industry in the 80s and 90s, upended the lives of redwood workers and the redwood forest itself. In 1986, a Wall Street firm led by a junk bond investor acquired the venerable Pacific Lumber Company. This is a legacy family owned firm that held the most old growth redwood of any company because they had continued to put away wood, sustain yield harvesting, keep it for the future. And the new owner decided to monetize this stock of old growth redwood so he could pay back the junk bonds that he had used it for. So cutting increased quickly to pay back those investors, and there was great damage to economics. As we hear, Robber barons bite the redwoods. Um, you can see before and after. Before, the Murphy family's management of Pacific Lumber was based on sustained yield logging method. After, Charles Hurwitz, Texas real estate tycoon, used Maxim to take over the Pacific Lumber Company. Uh, don't care if they were in the redwood or the ping pong industry. So the criticism of the redwood industry was intense. The ensuing redwood wars uh, pit the lumber companies and most of their workers against environmentalists who called for government action. Activists staged the Redwood Summer in 1990 to publicize the damage to the forest, and Julia Butterfly began her long tree sitting vigil in 1998. The state eventually passed legislation that required lumber companies to file plans for sustainable harvesting, and they made a deal with Pacific Lumber to acquire the most significant remaining stand of old-growth redwoods, the Headwaters Forest, and to impose a habitat conservation plan that restricted logging on the rest of its timber. Pacific Lumber never recovered from this, and they declared bankruptcy in 2007. And today, redwood is good. Redwood is green. It is the natural choice for green building. There are many smaller firms that focus on more sustainable use. They harvest second growth. They don't go after the old growth, and their wood is certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. And in a sort of ironic twist, Native Americans are again playing a role in the redwood forest by restoring habitat through dam removal and land construction projects that will bring back natural flora and fauna of the redwood range. Okay, I like to end with my favorite building in the whole book, which is the House of Hoo Hoo, because I just like saying House of Hoo Hoo. This was a pavilion building at the 1915 World's Fair in the Marina District of San Francisco that was built for a national organization of lumbermen known as the Concatenated Order of Hoo-Hoo. Near as I can tell, this was basically a drinking organization for salesmen, and they convened at every big conference to have their events. But somehow they convinced Bernard Maybeck, famous architect, to design them this really crazy kind of clubhouse that looks like a Greek temple, but has raw redwood tree trunks as its columns, bark and all. And if you look carefully at the temple part of the building and those columns, this actually echoes the Palace of Fine Arts, which was located right around the corner in a very simple way. So you can see a little taste of Maybeck in both these things, this one a little more rough-edged. And for me, this House of Hoo-Hoo highlights the theme of the book because it shows how the lumbermen were bringing redwood trees into the city, connecting across the city of woods. So it's kind of a metaphor for me. So if I try and summarize this work, I'd probably use the phrase, everything is connected, because it shows how the destruction of the redwood forest was tied to the development of San Francisco and vice versa. What might we learn from the story of Redwood? Well, there are two areas I'd highlight. First, I'd like to think this work suggests how we can and should try to connect places across great distances historically to help explain the physical development patterns, from the scale of individual buildings up to larger districts and cities that grow and decline over time. Like Cronin's Chicago, the city of Redwood was constructed through exchanges of physical material and capital between the woods and the central city. And this exchange linked lives and places across space. And second, I hope it demonstrates the need to understand the role of labor in the process of regional development. Another author, you can tell I rely on heavily, is, of course, Gray Brecken, whose book, Imperial San Francisco, talks about how elites, economic elites in California, worked at the expense of the countryside, took those resources and did what they want with them. But in this work, I've tried to look more directly at the spaces of everyday life to show how ordinary folks contributed to and dealt with the dynamics of growth in the American West. The story of Redwood is unique, but I think it's not atypical of industrial growth in the West. For me, redwood lumber is a kind of historical prelude to the globalization where things are made in one part of the world and used by people on the other side of the earth. I think we could imagine a city of wood in many kinds of cases. We could imagine a city of wood for the gold industry, for gold rush, a city of oil. At one point in San Francisco, we had a city of dot-coms, and maybe today we have a city of AI. And these are all ways of thinking about how we can connect different places across great distances through these economic ties. And if nothing else, I hope it'll help us appreciate how redwood trees are not simply just wonders of nature, but they're also key building blocks in the construction of a city of wood. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you've investigated the connection to the planting of eucalyptus here in the Bay Area, and whether or not that was, no, first of all, it's a failed effort, in terms of both hardwood and light and everything else. It doesn't work. But was it an effort to create a second market or compete market?
Yes. Yes, there were many uses. We see eucalyptus used in farmsteads for windbreaks, but I think the main thing was to use it as another kind of wood that would be cheap, that easy to grow, and would grow quickly. And as you point out, it didn't really work that well. It wasn't that easy to use. It twists. It's not very good lumber that way. So it was another way of trying to solve that problem of how can we have cheap material to work with and build quickly in the Bay Area. So, right.
I'm curious how old-growth redwood today impacts city planning, especially considering the regulations around what you can and can't do with old growth and the ways in which it currently exists in our cities and even in Palo Alto. There's plenty of old growth in someone's backyard and they can't really do anything about it. That's good, I guess.
Yeah, so I don't think in residential situations in places like Palo Alto or even San Francisco, there's a drive to preserve that particular tree. I think the effort goes into trying to save larger stands and the overall sense. I will say that cities now have sustainability standards, and I'm not sure I've seen one where you have to use. No, I have seen this. If you want to build for LEED, for example, the LEED requirements, you have to use Forest Steward Council wood. So that would be a way in which you say, sorry, you can't use that old growth lumber. We should be using a second growth to do the kind of thing. So I don't think we're seeing that in terms of individual trees in a backyard, but we're definitely seeing in terms of city planning of let's use the right materials for the long term. Okay. Yeah.
Did you have a chance to investigate the more local redwood industry, like the Big Basin area, Page Mill Road, Redwood City?
I had to choose. And I chose Humboldt County. So I don't really know that much about it. There's a great new book out, though. I just was on a panel with this guy whose name I can't remember. It, it's a history of environmentalism in all the Bay Area, and he has a great section on redwoods and all the details of Big Basin and the lumber industry in Santa Cruz County and that kind of thing. So I don't know as much about it, but it is fascinating, and it's probably still producing more redwood maybe than even Humboldt County at this point. So good. Like, yeah, white.
I'm curious if redwood was used. Was it used by like a particular type for a particular type of building in San Francisco, like homes or large buildings or industrial, or like what was sort of the main use? And then, do you have a favorite building built out of redwood in San Francisco?
Wow. Okay, so redwood was primarily used at first for structural uses, and they didn't build really big buildings at first. So redwood was, as I said, you can shape it really easily, so it's as good as pine for doing both structural and for doing the gingerbread ornament kind of thing. So yeah, it had particular uses. Over time, as I said, it kind of gave up to pine and cedar and other woods for that. So may I answer your question in terms of, yeah, okay. So it's primarily for residential because the office buildings on those became out of steel and stone. A favorite building out of redwood? How about my house in Russian Hill? And my old house in the Sunset District. It's just really fun to kind of like you're in the basement doing something like, hey, look, redwood. I know all about that kind of thing. So it's just everywhere. And it's kind of fun to kind of find those examples as we go.
Have you heard about the story of the marble murrelet bird and the redwood tree in Big Basin?
Redwood trees are so tall, we haven't really known what goes on at the top until more recently. It has its own environment, its own climate. You know, they take in the fog out of the air, and it creates this whole area. And so when scientists began to scale and see what's going on, there was a whole unique environment and an ecosystem that goes on up there. Another reason why it's important to keep these things. So no, I didn't know that.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question about, well, say the Redwoods League and the prominent women that were involved in saving the redwoods right around the time, 1918. Were any of those women, are you aware of, like, were any of them from the industry, or like, were they just environmentalists in general, or do you know much about that?
They were mostly middle class women. I have one story about an industry connection. Later in life, one of the Hoopers became a patron of the Save the Redwoods League in the like 1920s. Like maybe he just felt guilty for all he had done. I don't know. But no, they weren't connected. And it's a really important story that they basically just saw what was being done. At one point, this woman, Laura Mahan, who was the head of it, she took him out into the Bull Run area, and they stood there while the bulldozer was coming and the crews were coming, and they stopped the area from being logged. So it was a really key aspect of it. They got a lot of publicity for it, and they got all of the women's clubs in California interested in this. So they actually had a meeting of the statewide women's clubs in Eureka one year to kind of promote this and patronize what was going on. So it's a very key aspect for them. If you're interested in the Save the Redwoods League, there's a really good, fairly recent book by Greg King, who was an activist in the redwoods in the 80s and 90s, called The Ghost Forest. And he goes into really the underside of that story, because the Save the Redwoods League was founded by three men who were basically um, what's the genetic race system? They were eugenics. Thank you. They were eugenicists, and one of them wrote this horrible book that equated redwood trees with the end of the Nordic race, and that we had to protect the redwood trees like we had to protect the Nordic race. So there's a really sad underside to that story, and he does a really good job of looking at that kind of thing, as well as to the women in that as well. Yes.
If I remember correctly, when Horowitz took Pacific Lumber to bankruptcy, the Fisher family came in.
That's right.
Sort of old San Francisco family, and stopped clear cutting and expanded the acreage of redwoods. And I'm wondering what you think about that as a model for managing redwoods.
I don't know much about it, but it seems like it's going well. They're just a small operation, low expectations. They have a market, I think, because they're marketing in a sustainable way. And I've seen a little bit of accusations of greenwash about this, but I think that most people feel like it's doing pretty well. And yeah, it's another San Francisco connection that the Fisher family says, we'll take this over and preserve the operation. It's great. Yeah.
I'm curious about the kind of similarities with other industries. It seems like part of the story you're telling is that actually lumber is much like the story of industrialization elsewhere. I guess I think of the labor movement, the story of the labor movement in logging is really, really radical. I mean, the Wobblies, it's their biggest success other than maybe mining, hard rock mining. And the Wobblies are an extraordinarily unusual, part of the American labor movement. They have some success in industrial factories, but not that much compared with like logging and mining. And so if you look at it from the labor movement, it seems really different. It seems like a very different story than kind of being analogous to other areas of industrialization. So is that wrong, or is it that there's something specific about the circumstances of logging camps that leads them to be more predisposed toward kind of anarcho-syndicalism?
I think that's the answer, but it's interesting that Redwood didn't have that happen. So San Francisco, of course, was one of the most unionized places in the 19th century through the building trades. And there was this effort to try and work backwards through the production chain and have people be organized in the forest as well. And then you had the IWW, the Wobblies, who were very radical, coming down from the Pacific Northwest. And somehow, where this met, it didn't really take. So that whether it's because these company towns kind of overshadowed or kept the organizing from happening, or whether there was a tradition, not a lack of tradition of organizing, I don't know. But yes, I think the conditions of mining and logging camps would definitely make one want to be more active and take a more active role in improving your condition. But why that didn't take really well in Redwoods, I don't know. There's another good book is by Dan Cornford, who looks at this union effort to unionize throughout the years. And I think he comes to the conclusion that it just wasn't the right environment. They couldn't make that work, even though we had examples, the building trades in San Francisco, the sailors union, the Wobblies coming down, it really took place. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is about the San Franciscans prior to the Save the Redwoods era. How are their identities shaped by the use of redwood building materials? Do they have a kind of cultural relationship with what redwoods represented as uniquely Western or uniquely San Francisco? And my second question is, how did experiences with fire, either in the city or in the lumber areas, affect ideas about redwoods?
So there were tons of pictures. I show you that one kind of ad from the redwood industry about it lasts long, it won't burn. They had tons of pictures of examples of a fire burning the pine across the street and the redwood was saved. But it wasn't that clean a thing. It didn't really work exactly that way. In fact, in the 1906 earthquake and fire, there was examples of a lot of redwood buildings just completely gone. So it wasn't a perfect system. So I think that people were trying to make that case, and they had some truth to it, but it wasn't like it was going to prevent the fire entirely. What did people in San Francisco think of the redwoods before? That's a good question. I can't really think of how they had a cultural meaning before the 20th century. You don't really see a lot of people talking about their trip to the Redwoods. It was hard to get there. Um, we have the Muir Woods and Big Basin after the turn of the century. So I can't really think of how this would have been a lot of cultural meaning and pride in we're the people with the biggest trees kind of thing. So I have to think about that, but I can't. Can you think of anything that would could? Okay. But it's an excellent question. So what did they have some kind of cultural role before we started to lose them and realize what we had? Great. Good.
Yeah, thank you. This was fascinating. As I was listening to you, I used to work in construction in Phoenix and used to work with lumber a lot, and but we never used any redwoods. And I assume it's because the moisture in the redwoods would disappear or it would dry out by the time we get to Phoenix. I don't know, because we used to not get anywhere from anywhere wet for that very reason. Once you get to Phoenix, then the wood warps and when it dries out. But it made me wonder though. You're talking about San Francisco. Is the redwood going anywhere else? Are they shipping it across the Pacific? Are they shipping it to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't think it's because of the water content. I think it's just that by the time you were working with it, redwood was more expensive. And so it became more of a specialty material than to be used in general construction. But yes, redwood was going all over the world. It was going to South America. A lot of it went to Hawaii. Some of it went to Asia. So it would be dried. It would be seasoned so that it would be drier to work better and to be have less weight when it was sent. So it was definitely going all these places. Generally, it would be sent to San Francisco first because that was sort of the nerve center and where it would go from there. Later on, there would be shipments that would go to other places. But yes, it was a worldwide commodity and was shipped in a lot of different places. Now, good. Okay, in the back.
And also two questions. One, what is the role of the United States Forest Service in this story? And two, what was the impact of the spotted owl controversy?
Great. So the U.S. Forest Service comes in the early part of the 20th century. I wouldn't say they have the biggest role in the redwood forest as opposed to others, but the key was that they were encouraging this practice of forestry. And so actually the biggest impact was from the University of California's forestry school, which is one of the first forestry schools. They didn't necessarily work for the Forest Service, although the Forest Service did do reports on quantity and what was going on with it. But it was really mostly about people being trained in this practice and then convincing the companies this was a good idea for you to have a forester who could help you manage the cut at the long term. Second question was spotted owl. Well, spotted owl had a big impact. I kind of mixed it up in there with the Redwood Wars, but that was part of it. And that it was part of this environmental effort to say, just like the marbled merlin, it sounds like this is a creature that lives in that particular environment, and you can't just have this clear cutting. You have to have managed wildlife plans. And so it was part of that effort to bring the regulations. My recollection is that when there was a Republican administration, not much happened. When there was a Democratic administration, a lot happened. And this kind of went back and forth over time. And the whole thing basically kind of disappeared when the industry collapsed. So now there's really not a huge issue in terms of habitat. It seems to be satisfied.
I wonder if you could speak more about the growth of the like lumber mills and company towns up in Eureka and how that affected San Francisco. I mean, were people who had been working in those industries moving up to those company towns? Were they moving into other work? Were there holdouts down here?
So there were connections. A lot of them, as I said, were sort of at the business level, the administrative level, people in San Francisco helping to make decisions about what's going up there. The workers came from all over. As I mentioned, some of the Eastern and Southern Europeans who came around 1910, 1915. Before that, you had a lot of people from all over Europe who were coming directly. They're coming to the U.S. to immigrate. Oh, my cousin's up in the Redwoods, I'll go up there. Or I hear it's nice living up there. So it wasn't like there was this constant group of people from San Francisco moving up there. There are more relationships through that area. So it wasn't like it was a direct connection in that sense. More that people, the only real connection would be that floating army of labor, that they would be in the Central Valley for a while. They'd been in the Redwoods for a while, come back to San Francisco, work on the railroads and that sort of thing. So there wasn't that kind of movement back and forth of people living in those areas.
So just to follow up, so then when I assume mills started to close here, like did that hurt the city or?
I think San Francisco's moved on to other things. Yes, obviously, if your life was as a machine operator in a planing mill and it went away, I'm not aware of a lot of movement of those people up to Humboldt or to Mendocino because the job went up there. I think they found other work in that. And the building trades, of course, were so important here that there were lots of opportunities here in the city. I don't think there are a lot of people then trucked up there to follow their job where it went. Way in the back.
I do know after the '06 earthquake, a lot of workers came to rebuild San Francisco.
Yeah.
And were lobbying. I mean, my family was here. And they came from Maine. There's the Union Lumber Company from Maine, relocated. I mean, there's a museum in Elk, Mendocino County, that does a great job of describing how they were really in competition to get that lumber down to the city.
Yeah.
And they were Maine Irish, Scots Irish.
Yeah.
But my other family, who was in the lumber business, were Swedes. And my grandfather was a wobbly, but there wasn't much market for wobblies at the time because these people were really poor and they just wanted the work.
Yeah. Well, that migration pattern happens from the beginning. So a lot of people from Maine, like the Hoopers, came from, I think it's Mache, Maine, almost into New Brunswick. And so there was a lot of that going back and forth. And I always push back on the '06 quake. Yes, there was a lot of demand, but I think that chart's helpful to show that it went up and then it kind of came back down again. And it wasn't until after World War II that we really saw the impact of the demand on that and the effect on the forest. So yes, it's absolutely true that a lot of people piled in to try and help rebuild San Francisco, but it was even more impact later on in the century. Okay. Can we get one more?
That slide you showed of the seedlings being planted.
Yeah.
Were they a monoculture of planting at that time, or were the forests at that time exclusively redwoods?
They were only interested in the material that they were going to grow and then use. So it was a monocultural nursery. There was not an effort to mix in species or create a habitat of any kind. It was just, we're doing this thing and we're going to go through there. There's some material in the biology library at Berkeley on some of those nurseries early on if you're interested.
Please join me in thanking Jen for this wonderful.